Flipping the border. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, there is a story in the New York Times that I wouldn't believe was in the New York Times, except that I read it in the New York Times. And it is under the headline, "An Earthquake Along the Border. Trump flipped Hispanic South Texas." It turns out that the president-elect, won 12 of the region's 14 counties, those along the border with Mexico. That is up from 2016 when he only won 5 of them. Here's the lead in the New York Times. Nowhere in the United States have historically Democratic counties shifted so far and so fast in the direction of former President Donald J. Trump as they have in the Texas communities along the Rio Grande, where Hispanic residents make up the overwhelming majority. Gentlemen, this is not just breaking news. It is part of a longer-term trend where Donald Trump has essentially gotten the Republican Party back to this idea that we represent working people. And by we, I mean the Republican Party. Technically, I'm in Texas and I don't have to register in any party. But to go from 5 counties, Stephen Green, in 2016 to 12 out of the 14 border counties, there were 2 basic messages, according to this story, that were effective along the border. Number one was the economy. People are very aware of what they pay for things. And not only that, not only are things getting more expensive, but a lot of Latino and Hispanic voters, both of which are terrible handles to refer to people by, but the people who live in that area who speak Spanish, come from Spanish-speaking countries, both of them, they looked at this and they said, it looks like one party is determined to destroy the oil industry and the natural gas industry, and that's where my brother and my dad and my cousins all work. And so we don't want to destroy that industry. So number one, you're trying to kill our jobs. Number two, everything's more expensive at the grocery store. But the second major issue, Steve, was immigration and the uncontrolled border. And many so-called Latinos living in those border counties along the Rio Grande were disturbed by the fact that there was this untrammeled flow coming in from Mexico, including not just Mexican immigrants illegally, but also people from Honduras and El Salvador and Costa Rica, other
China.
Countries in South America or Latin America or China. That's right. So, Steve, what I think is phenomenal here, and tell me what you think about this, is that Trump in many ways has reshaped the Republican electorate by bringing out people who would have been unlike, and there are double-digit leaps of increases by Latino voters in some of these areas. Is this going to be a persistent change? In other words, can the GOP hang on to this long after Donald Trump fades from the scene? And if so, what will it take to do so?
That is the trick. Look, Donald Trump increased his share of the Latino vote from 2016 to 2024 by about 2/3. It was a little over 60% increase in his share of the Latino vote. And I want to say he ended up getting something like 49% of Latino vote, or maybe that was just Latino males. I can't remember off the top of my head. And he increased his share of the Black American vote, again from 2016 to 2024, by almost double. He went from 8% of that vote in 16 to 15% in 2024, which is what I call a good start. There are constituencies that the Democrats haven't just sort of assumed they would get their votes, and they've been correct in their assumptions, but whose interests the national party has actively ignored or trampled on. These voters should not be Democrats, but we have had these country club Republicans who were just deathly afraid of being called racist for going after voters, for trying to appeal to voters. They would get labeled racist because that was the Democrats' trump card. It was you can't even appeal to these voters. These are our voters, and if you try and make a pitch to them, we're going to call you a racist, and that's the worst thing that can happen. Well, Donald Trump, in some ways, is a very thin-skinned guy, man. You get him riled up, and he can be prickly. In other ways, he is the thickest-skinned, toughest SOB that the Republicans have ever been lucky enough to have as their nominee 3 times now, because he didn't care about the Democrats' race card. He didn't care about being called Hitler or any of this other stuff. He went right to these constituencies and said, look, I want you to vote for me, and these are the reasons why. And gosh, Scott, you've been advising Republicans to do this for as long as we've been doing this show, and we started this show in 2009. That's 15 years. And Donald Trump, I know personally, is not your cup of tea, but here is the Republican who took your advice, who went into these communities, who made these pitches, and it's working. So it's a good start. The trick going forward, and this cuts to the heart of your question, is how do we take these Trump voters and turn them into Republican voters? Because Trump doesn't get to run again. This is it. This is his last stand. He's got to make the most of it. The party has to make the most of it. And that means developing tough hides. That means getting out of the country club realm and finding the next Trump, finding the next Reagan, finding the next Morning in America, we're going to make things better for everybody candidate. I don't pretend to know who that is. 2028 is a long time away, and I believe in the primary process, in the people who make up the party. The people who make up the party choosing that nominee, and then the rest of us, whatever our differences were during the primary, the rest of us getting behind that nominee. And I want those voters who select those nominee, I want them to be blacker, I want them to be browner, I want them to be more Asian, I want them to be more Jewish than they ever have been before, because those are the voters who turned out for the Republican Party, who turned out for Donald Trump on Tuesday. Yep. And they need to be making the selection of helping making the selection of our next candidate in 2028, and not just for the White House, but in the midterms and all the way going forward, because we've got to be the party of all Americans, not the party that's afraid to say, hey, we want your vote even though you've been Democrats before.
Not only did Donald Trump put a great deal of emphasis upon that area of the country and didn't tone down his message at all, his anti-illegal immigration message. Bill, here's an example that's in this New York Times story. One of the biggest swings came in Starr County, Starr. Starr County, it's a rural county of about 65,000 people, a bunch of small towns along the border. And the county flipped Republican on Tuesday, backing Mr. Trump by about 16 percentage points. Now you think, well, that's really good. I mean, if you can win anywhere by 16 points, you're doing great. But in 2016, against Hillary Clinton, Trump lost that county by 60 points, 6-0. And not 16. And then he just won it by 16 as a 76-point reversal, essentially, in his fortunes in that area. Bill, there was a lot of talk before the election because of some remarks by a comedian at a Madison Square Garden rally that not only was Trump going to lose the Puerto Rican vote, but he was going to lose all Latinos in unity behind the people who were offended by a comedian making jokes about Puerto Rico. Kamala Harris lobbied for vigorously and received the endorsement of rap star Bad Bunny. And so Bad Bunny came out for Kamala, and they go, well, that's the death knell, because Bad Bunny is beloved in the Latino community. And here we see 12 of 14 counties going Trump. And this is not just along the border, but it's everywhere. But I think, Bill, what strikes me is along the border, where you would think, or we were told, that the heartache among families of being separated and the fear of deportation and all that kind of stuff, not only are these people saying yes to Republicans, and Ted Cruz won big there too, and he rallied there and ran ads in Spanish, but they're saying yes to Republicans because of the economy, and yes to the Republicans because of immigration policy, exactly the opposite of what the Democrats thought they'd see.
Well, you know who got the answer on this exactly right? And I'm not being flip here. They got it exactly right. And it was MSNBC. They got the answer exactly right. They lamented the fact that that they got the answer right because they're on the evil side of the argument, but they pinned it exactly right. What they said was what happened in these counties was that these voters, these misguided, poor, stupid voters, decided to identify as Americans rather than identify as Latinos. They openly said, almost verbatim, they said they chose their national identity over their racial solidarity. That's what they said. And I said, well, that's Yes, you're right. You got it exactly right. They went the e pluribus unum vote. They voted like Americans for the simple reason that they are Americans. This idea that the people who are trooping up here, when we talk about the illegal border crossings, and for most of the history of the southern border being a problem, it's been Mexican immigration across the border. But for the last 15, 20 years, the number of people that are coming to the country that are actually Mexicans is I don't know what the actual percentage is, but we're seeing boatloads of people from South America, Central America. We're seeing a lot of Chinese immigrants, a lot of immigrants from Africa, immigrants from Arab countries that have flown into the Western Hemisphere to come through the southern border. So even the hey, you're not down with your own racial. These are not Mexican immigrants that we're talking about, and they're not coming for the same reasons. But I don't actually think that's a major part of it. I think the major part of it is that the Latino voters in these counties are the ones who had strangers trooping across their yards at midnight and scaring the living crap out of them because of the safety of their daughters and their children and their property and all the rest of it. And they reacted, shockingly enough, the way that Anglo-Americans would have reacted and did in fact react along the border. And this is why I was so sanguine about this election, because once I realized that this was no longer about Republicans and Democrats, it was about insiders and outsiders, I said to myself, the country is learning its lesson. The country is learning that the elites that govern us don't care about us. The non-border example would be to say, well, yeah, gas prices are $6 a gallon, and a Whopper Jr. with cheese and a medium Sprite is $11.20 at the McDonald's, at the Burger King here down the street from me. But this is actually a great economy, and we don't know why you're so worried about inflation as we take our limousines home from our jobs and our skyscrapers to our $1 million apartments. This election showed that the people have lost faith in Washington and the mainstream media, and as an ancillary, all of the billionaires in Hollywood to influence their decision on what their own lying eyes are telling them. And what their own lying eyes are telling them is that grocery prices are unaffordable, gas prices are unaffordable, and there's long lines of armed strangers coming through my backyard every single night, and I don't like it.
There's a county, remember the town of Eagle Pass? That was kind of a flashpoint for the immigration debate. I think this was the same area where Governor Abbott set up the buoys in the middle of the river to restrict illegal crossings at that shallow point in the river. In 2016, Trump lost that county, Maverick County, where Eagle Pass is, by 56 points. In 2020, he lost it by 9 points. In 2024, he won it by 19 points.
Damn.
Good Lord.
And I think what's exciting to me is that people are waking up to the realization that just because somebody mouths platitudes about their concern for you doesn't mean they have your best interest at heart. And that the people who have your best interest at heart are those who are actually taking action to make your life better, to tangibly change the way things are. There's a quote in here, which I can't fish out of the story at the moment, where one Republican strategist says, it sounds kind of silly, but people remember what eggs cost. And I'm like, what do you mean it sounds kind of silly? That's fundamental. That's fundamental to how people evaluate, because they see that. It's kind of like signs on a gas station where you can see it. It's the way billionaires and millionaires look at stock market tickers. People look at egg prices and gas prices.
Oh, that's great.
And when they see those egg prices going up, and there was one woman quoted in this story who said, I no longer take my kid to the grocery store because I don't want to have to explain to them why I can't buy the things they want. And this campaign, not just President Trump, but all up and down the ticket, including Ted Cruz in Texas, spoke to these people as Americans, as you pointed out rightly, spoke to them as Americans, not as some sort of problem, but as full citizens who had agency and had the ability to change the country's destiny. I have a colleague, I don't know why this is upsetting me so, I have a colleague that I work with, and his sister and also works at the same place, and they're both they were born in Mexico. Recently, my colleague went back and visited his family in Mexico and had a great trip there. Came back after about a week, and we've talked a lot about it. He is helping me to learn Spanish, to get better at speaking Spanish, not only so I can help customers whose primary language is Spanish, but also because my grandson lives in South America and is bilingual, or will be as he gets old enough to be lingual. And anyway, I saw him yesterday. I walked over to him and I said, you know, you are the new power in the United States. And I didn't have to say anything else. He smiled and he reached over and fist bumped me and nodded his head. And he said, I know. And we've never talked about politics ever. And at that moment, I realized, wow, he voted for Trump. He voted Republican. And the sense that what I was getting from him was the sense that I matter here. We have the ability to influence the direction of the country, and we count. And that was just a little snapshot moment, but across the country, people who have been born in other lands and saw for years their votes being treated as a birthright by the other party are now realizing they have agency, they have influence, they have power, and their use of that can make this country a better place, not only for their families, but for generations to come, those born here and those born elsewhere. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.